Hi everybody, thank you for being here. This is my presentation on multicultural education and inequities in classroom and school structure. So we're going to be talking about how you can make your own classroom more multicultural and what kinds of things you can change to the structure of your classroom, structures of the schools, and how that can also help drive us to a more multicultural place in education. So just to go over the outline, we're going to talk about what multicultural education is, and then we are going to look at the classroom and school structure, including but not limited to all the topics up here: tracking and retention, standardized testing, curriculum, pedagogy, climate, physical structure, roles of students and teachers, and family and community involvement. So first, I'm going to have you do a quick write, and you can do that anywhere on your slides page. What does multicultural education look like? Do your teaching practices reflect your vision of what multicultural education looks like? Why or why not? So I will give you a couple minutes to write about that, and then we'll table share. But go ahead and just write about it right now. So the 7 types of basic characteristics of multicultural education, according to Nieto, are that it is anti-racist education, basic education, it is important for all students, it is pervasive, it is education for social justice, it's a process, and it is critical pedagogy. So what it currently looks like in many places, a lot of people think that, yeah, I have a multicultural education going on in my classroom. We have an ethnic festival at our school. We have multicultural bulletin boards put up, which actually most of the time ends up perpetuating even more stereotypes. There's obviously the sanitized curriculum, so we'll teach you about the civil rights movement, but just briefly, and we're not going to talk about anything uncomfortable, and that's the big problem with curriculum. That yes, there are a lot of things written by people from all different cultures, but they've kind of been weeded through to make sure that they take out anything that could be offensive, any material that anyone would find offensive. These textbook companies go through, they take these stories or these articles and they put them through many screenings to make sure that nothing in there could be offensive to anybody. So kids aren't really getting the full story of what happened in history, or the full story of, if it's a story that's in their literature textbook, they don't get that either. Literature written by women and people of various cultural backgrounds. So yes, we're reading a story by Gary Soto, and there's an author study in the English textbook on Sounders Cisneros, and there's a story by Naomi Shihab Nye, and so a lot of people think that that is enough to make it a multicultural education, but it's really not. And then it looks like achievement gaps. We know that kids who are underrepresented oftentimes are not achieving at the same rate as their white peers. So what it should look like, it's more than simply adding content from other cultures, although that is important, but we also want to think about the changing of our school structure and our classroom structure, and how that can also help push us forward in a multicultural way. Obviously, we have no control over things like society and school funding, but we definitely have to do what we can with what we have to make sure that we are exiting students out of our school and into society that know how to participate in a democratic society, and they know how to question things that they don't think are right, and they know how to stand up for themselves. So the first category is tracking and retention, and tracking is the homogeneous grouping of students by ability level within classes. A lot of times these decisions are made based on test scores, based on forms that their parents filled out, based on what their first language is, and sometimes based on teacher recommendation, but not always. It definitely maintains race and social class privilege, and there are good intentions because they were hoping that by tracking students they would get access to the curriculum that would help them out the most. They didn't want something to be so over their heads that they would just give up. So they thought, hey, we'll track kids and we'll put them all together so that everybody's on the same level. But that's not always what happens, as we know at our school. And what happens is that the advanced classes end up full of the white kids and the middle class kids, and the lower level tracked classes end up with the underrepresented kids, who are probably struggling in other things besides just in school. For instance, in my transitional English class, there are no white kids in that class. It's all Latino, African American, Filipino students. So tracking definitely puts more of a divide between students, and it really hinders them more than it helps them. It can have devastating consequences because students who are tracked know that they're tracked. They're not stupid. You hear kids saying, oh, I'm in the dumb class all the time. This is dumb English. I hear that all the time. That can be detrimental to them, and they feel like they should just give up. Students in the low levels end up with a watered down curriculum a lot of the time because people don't have high expectations for them when they really should. They should be helping the students access the education, access the curriculum, and they should still have those high expectations for those students. All right, retention obviously is holding students back a grade. And that is also often based on test scores, and there's absolutely no evidence to support that retention actually helps students. In most cases, it increases the likelihood that they're going to drop out of school. Kids who have been retained once are 50% more likely to drop out of school. Kids who have been retained twice are 90% more likely to drop out of school. Most kids are retained in first grade. With good intentions, again, like tracking. They hope that the students are going to learn that second year what they didn't learn the first year. But in fact, students achieve at lower levels. They complete fewer years of school. They have worse social emotional outcomes than students who are promoted on to the next grade. Also, 2.5 million kids are retained in the United States, and most of them are low-income students, boys, and students of color. So retaining does not help them catch up with their peers. It actually holds them back. But there is clear connection between co-curricular and extracurricular activities connected with achievement. So eliminating retention, eliminating tracking, and adding in more extracurricular activities would be a way to help those students who have the gaps and who are not learning all the material that they're supposed to learn. So what can you do? There can be interventions during the school day to help students who are a little bit behind. You can have mandatory summer school so that students are still going on to the same grade, the next grade. They're on the same track classes as everybody else. And again, more co-curricular and extracurricular activities, and they need to be detracked. So everybody has the opportunity to join any of these extracurricular activities. You can do things like have the kids put up posters in different languages, asking people to join their club or their group. And the more you offer the students, the more likelihood that they'll find something that they are passionate about and that they enjoy, and that they'll have a closer connection to school and want to try harder. Standardized testing, everybody's favorite. It was originally used to identify mentally retarded children, and now is often used to segregate and sort students, so it's used in tracking. Students were put through these tests in the beginning of the 20th century. It was American Indian and Mexican American children, and a psychologist named Louis Terman said of these students, their dullness seems to be racial, or at least inherent in family stock from which they came. Children of this group should be segregated in special classes. They cannot master abstractions, but they can often be made efficient workers. And the same was said about blacks, Jews, and Italians. So it was pretty racist from the beginning. Definitely did not even give students who are underrepresented, students of color, a chance to perform well. The time spent on test-taking strategies has been great, and we all know that we used to spend at least a couple weeks teaching kids how to take the test when we had the CSTs. And that time could be spent on more engaging learning experiences instead of teaching kids how to eliminate answers and how to read the questions first. But textbook companies and testing companies make so much money off these standardized tests every year. They make even more money off of private tutoring for high stakes testing. So they write these tests that only a small portion of the student population are going to do well on. And then because so many kids are not doing well, or they're afraid they're not going to do well, then they offer tutoring too, so they're benefiting in more ways than one. Parents pay to have their kids tutored so that they'll do well on these tests, but only the well-off families can afford this tutoring. So again, you're putting a huge separation between the kids who can't afford and the kids who can't afford to go through this expensive tutoring so that they can do well on these standardized tests. And that's not just tests like the CSTs, but also the SATs. I took an SAT review class when I was in high school. My mom paid for it. There were kids at my school who couldn't afford it, and that definitely gave me an advantage over them where it shouldn't have. The ACT, any other standardized test that the kids have to take, and that's not just in high school and middle school, but also for college. Studies have shown that a GPA is a better indicator of success than an SAT score. To use myself as an example, I am not a good test taker. Despite having had the Princeton review for the SATs, I did not do well. I got mediocre scores, but I graduated high school with a 4.3 GPA. Not a good test taker, but I was a very hard worker and very dedicated to my education. So GPAs definitely show more what the students can do than test scores. High stakes testing affects teacher creativity and autonomy. We remember when we had this whole new adoption of textbooks where they wanted you to use the textbook with fidelity, follow the pacing guide, you could not stray because they wanted to know if these textbooks were working. That significantly limited teacher autonomy and creativity. I remember being miserable the first couple of years because I wasn't allowed to teach what I wanted to teach. I had to follow exactly the pacing guide. Some of the stories were really boring and the kids hated them. It would have been nice to have had the autonomy to bring in some other things that would have been more engaging. So what can you do? Obviously, standardized tests are not going away. But you can advocate for minimal testing. You can join a group, get a bunch of like-minded people together, and you can advocate so that there isn't as much testing. Last year, we over-tested the kids. They had performance tasks, benchmarks, the NWEA, the SBAC, and they were testing forever. And so I would definitely advocate for less testing this year. And that's something that we probably have to advocate more at a district level. Another thing you can do is offer test-taking skills, tutoring after school. So those kids who can't afford to have the review classes or who need extra help, those kids can have the same kind of help and have the opportunity to perform as well as their peers who can afford these kinds of review sessions. Curriculum. So curriculum represents what should be learned and under what circumstances. It is perceived to be consequential and necessary knowledge is generally by those who are dominant in a society. So decisions in public schools are usually made by people furthest from the students. They're made by the school district or the state level. They're made by textbook companies and boards of education with little input from teachers, parents, or students. Minority children often don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum, and if they do, it's usually through the lens of others. So American Indians were portrayed as savages. African Americans read sanitized versions of slavery. They don't really get into how awful it was. They don't tell a lot about they say, that Lincoln freed the slaves. They don't say a lot about some of the other African Americans who helped that, who stood up and fought back who, we learn about Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and that's pretty much it. But there were so many other people who really helped with the liberation of the slaves. Mexican Americans read of westward expansion, but with no information about the fact that their ancestors were already living on the land, and that they were kicked off the land. Working class children hear nothing about their history except for the struggle of the 8-hour workday. Females are left wondering why, half of the human population is left out, because we don't hear a lot about women. We hear much more about men. So cultural language traditions, they're not really honored within a mainstream curriculum. Just reading something from the perspective of somebody of another culture isn't enough to really have a multicultural education. Teachers are often reluctant to talk about things that are uncomfortable to them. So perhaps that is one reason why we don't talk about slavery at length the way we should. We don't talk about the civil rights movement the way that we should. When I teach To Kill a Mockingbird, I have to teach them all about the civil rights movement. I have to teach them about how just because African Americans were freed doesn't necessarily mean that everybody was nice to them all of a sudden they could get jobs. They still faced a lot of racism, and that's something that my students have a hard time understanding, and no one's ever told them that before. And I think it is because it's hard to talk about these things that are uncomfortable. The textbook companies also dilute what the kids read. They have to make sure that we're not so left-wing that we're offending people in Texas, but they also have to make sure that they're not so right-wing that we're offending people in California. Textbook companies focus on California and Texas mostly because they're the biggest states, and they want to make sure that they're not offending anybody, so they just water down everything and they take out anything that could be portrayed as offensive. So students are not learning real accounts of what happened. They're learning glossed over, glamorized versions of history. What can you do? You can investigate alternate perspectives, other historical events. How did other people react to these historical events? During the Revolutionary War, kids should learn about the experiences of the African Americans, the American Indians, the women, the working people. What was their perspective? What was their experience of the Revolutionary War? In math, you can find out how other cultures or other countries do the same kind of math. How would they solve these problems? Holidays, multiple perspectives on holidays like Columbus Day. Talk about the difference between how Columbus thought of it as a discovery, but then what about the American Indians? How would they have told the same story? And even learn about other holidays that we don't even know exist, that we don't put enough emphasis on those other holidays that are not just, our bank holidays that the white people celebrate. You can use your students as lessons. Talk about their experiences, their cultures, their languages, their talents. Have them teach a class how to do something that they're talented at. Or if their parents are very talented in a skill, their parents could come in and teach your class how to do something. So I have lesson plans for each subject matter, and these come from teachingtolerance.org, but they're really great ways to look at other perspectives, to teach about social justice within every single subject area. I've got science, I've got PE, I've got math, I've got English, I've got social studies, I have music, I have art, so I got everybody covered. I have copies of lesson plans for everybody, and I'm not saying you have to teach them, but maybe use them as a way to get inspiration on how to change your curriculum so that it is more multicultural, and so you are valuing everybody, and everybody who sits in your classroom feels like their background is valued, and have a lesson that they can connect to. So pedagogy, this is the strategies, techniques, and approaches used by teachers in their classrooms. A lot of time it is rote learning. It is read, answer questions, memorize, chalk and talk. So what I've been doing, write stuff on the board, stand up here and talk, and the kids just sit there. And students actually prefer when they're held to higher expectations and that lessons are meaningful to their lives, like the teaching tolerance lessons. So I want you to think, pair, share right now. What does good teaching look like? Write down. So good teaching occurs when students are involved with issues they perceive as vital. They're involved with explanations of differences in race, culture, religion, ethnicity, and gender. You help them see major concepts, big ideas, general principles, rather than isolated facts. Involved in planning their education, involved in applying ideals such as fairness, equity, and justice in their world. Teaching tolerance, again, was really good for that. Actively involved in heterogeneous groups and asked to question common sense or widely accepted assumptions. So teaching them that it is okay to question, but also teaching them the right way to go about it. So what can you do? You can make curriculum more inviting. You can have them do a variety of different learning environments. Sometimes they do group work, sometimes they do collaborative research, peer tutoring for kids who aren't getting it and somebody is getting it, honoring the fact that that kid has gotten it, and sending a peer over to help their friend. Group reflections, dialogue, debates, philosophical chairs. I think we learned about, most of us who took the AVID training, but philosophical chairs is great for that because it's kind of like a debate, but it's not to the point where they're going to be yelling and screaming over each other. Action projects are really big, and technology and digital media. Really getting those in whenever you can, giving kids a chance to use technology as well, because that's what they know and they're really into it. So climate and physical structure, and this pertains to schools and classrooms. Environment is a big factor, and schools obviously need lots of repairs. Our school does, lots of schools in our district do, and it can promote or inhibit educational equity. The connection between poor student achievement and condition of school buildings is big. Obviously, violence on campus can affect learning in a school, and small schools versus big schools. There are some schools that are giant, and kids kind of feel lost. And in smaller schools, kids feel more of like a family connection. I think that's why a lot of our kids go to Marina High, and even though they don't think they're gonna like it, they end up loving it because it's small, they know everybody, they know where they fit in there, and they don't feel lost. So one study found that facility quality was an important factor and predictor in the decisions of teachers who decide to stay or leave, probably even more than salary. And that also affects students. If they don't feel like anyone cares about their school, it's run down, it's trashed, they're not going to take good care of it, so it's going to perpetuate the problem. And B, they're not going to put any effort in because they're going to think nobody cares. Schools that have a lot of fights, that have a lot of violence, obviously kids aren't going to feel safe there. They're not going to put their best foot forward in those situations. And that's not just even physical violence, but silencing their voices, telling them that their opinion doesn't matter, their voice doesn't matter. Not letting them get involved in school. And teachers and administrators who are hostile and authoritarian, those kinds of schools are more likely to be vandalized by their own students. And then schools who have clear cooperation among the teachers and administrators, and they have clear expectations for students, like we've done a good job from the beginning of the year with those clear expectations. The trash hasn't been as big of an issue this year, which I think is great. The classrooms getting painted over the summer was awesome because now we don't have this like peeling paint on our walls anymore. And I think that is good. I think it's a big factor. It's one of the reasons why I painted my classroom, because I felt like I needed some kind of place where the kids felt good when they came in, but also, you spend more time in your classroom than you do at home during the school year, so I wanted somewhere where I felt comfortable and felt relaxed when I came in. So what can you do? You can make your classroom more inviting. Put things up on the walls, put student work up on the walls, put colorful things on the walls, posters, anything that makes the kids feel invited in. Have different desk arrangements for different kinds of learning, so collaborative desk setups and individual work desk setups. Have campus cleanups where everybody pitches in and they clean up the campus. That will help them learn to take care of the campus more. That would be a good thing for the leadership class to do. I did it last year with my leadership kids. I might have my Avid kids do it this year. Play music. Music is a big thing. Kids like to hear music. Make it a place students want to come and feel comfortable coming to. So the role of teachers and students, obviously there are sometimes the lack of opportunity for students to be active in school and in their education. They don't really have a lot of say. Decisions aren't run by them. Even student council members, a lot of times it's decisions already made, now you go do this. And I think that last year when we were developing our new behavior plan or discipline plan for the school, I think it would have been a good opportunity to get kids involved and hear what they think, what they thought the biggest problems were, maybe even what they thought fair punishments would be for certain behaviors on campus. That would have been a great time to get those kids involved. Teachers are often discouraged from getting involved. We know that. They don't like people who are, the greasy wheel or the sticky wheel, who express their opinions very loudly, and teachers then feel deflated or discouraged because they don't feel like they have any power either. Teachers feel alienated, and when they feel alienated, they can hardly be expected to help students become empowered. So what can you do? Like I said, give students more opportunities for decision making. I talked about the behavior and discipline meetings we had last year. It would have been a good time to get students involved. Even in the PBIS celebrations, let students decide what the next celebration is going to be. Even if you have to send out a quick survey to all the advisory classes. Teachers should get more autonomy. I feel really thankful because I feel like we have a lot of autonomy at the school, and we can choose our own lessons and make sure that as long as we're hitting the standards, we can do that whatever way we want. And I know that a lot of schools don't have that, and I feel very blessed for that. We can always work to change the public's attitude about teachers, because we all know that teachers are not very valued by a lot of people. A lot of people think that anybody can be teachers. Oh, if I can't do this, I just might teach. Like, that's a fallback plan. Which is insulting, because to me it's like, no, I've wanted to be a teacher my whole life, and you have no idea how hard my job is. So don't just say, oh, if that doesn't work out, I can teach. And community and family involvement. Children obviously benefit from family involvement, and when the school works with the community, you have higher achievement. It's sometimes impossible for parents to get to schools because they come from single parent homes. So it's important that we find ways to get those parents involved anyway. Maybe they can't come to school, but maybe they can do something else. Educators aren't trained on working with families. I didn't take a working with families class when I was in the credential program, right? So a lot of educators don't know how. And some teachers mistake uninvolvement from parents as parents who don't care, when really different cultures are involved in their kids' education in different ways. So there's a misconception. So what can you do? You can connect to the community, which we do a good job here. We've got the teen center. The police are on campus, and it's not a threatening presence. They play basketball against the 8th graders at the end of the year. Anna's got the Ocean Guardian grant, and she's doing the garden, and so we have a pretty good connection to our community, which I think is good. But sending out newsletters, school newsletters, class newsletters, printing them in multiple languages, not just English and Spanish, which I know can be difficult, but we do have a huge diverse population at our school, and I think it's only fair that we don't make kids feel like, oh, only English and Spanish matters and my language doesn't matter. Food, if you feed them, they will come. I interviewed for a school a long time ago when I first started teaching, when they talked about how they had back to school night and none of the parents showed up. But then they had a huge spaghetti dinner brought to the school, catered, and everybody came. So bring food. Sometimes parents work a lot and they can't come to school things because they have to feed their kids, and that's the only time they, get to be home. But so make that easy for them. And with the potlucks last year, we used to cram a lot of people that Katie used to do the award potlucks. That was great because people knew they would be fed. So things like that are good ways that you can get your community involved. So what I'd like you to do right now is write down one thing that you can do in your classroom to make it a beneficial learning experience for all students. And there's a blank piece of paper at the end of your notes packet, and you can just write it down on that piece of paper. And this can be related to curriculum, classroom structure, pedagogy, or any of the other topics covered today. So you're going to write it down, and then I want you to crumble it into a ball. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds to have a snowball fight, throw them around. And when the time is up, I want you to pick one up that's closest to you, and we will have a share out. All right, and I have some resources. Rethinkingschools.org is a good one. This is the book that I mentioned. Teaching for Change has some great resources on teaching tolerance. And I just have one final thought on multicultural education, best expressed through this spoken word.
They say those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So it must be the case that he who wrote history wanted a rendition, regurgitation, relapse, or repeated mistakes, because all I see when I watch the news are headlines that match the chapter titles